sessions scheduled each night next week in preparation for the Friday night main event. And it sounds like Friday night fights that used to be on TV. Well, the irony is it could be the Friday night fights for anybody trying to keep up and follow me on the dance floor. But anyway, it's all for a good cause, and so we're going to be beginning our program a little bit earlier for at least until the end of next week, through next week. And then perhaps, later on, we talked about shifting to a permanent 3 to 5 position rather than the 4 to 6. But we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, let me again welcome you to today's program. Let me thank you for your willingness to give up a portion of your day, of your valuable time, to us here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's a pleasure. It's a responsibility, very honestly, which I take very, very seriously. My mission each day is to make sure that whatever time you can afford to spend with us is time. At the end, I can honestly say that I believe for those who tuned in, it was time well spent. We look forward to hearing from you. We want to make this a dialogue rather than a monologue, and I think eventually that is going to happen because there's going to come a point in time where most of the relevant information is out there. And as you know, if you tuned in yesterday, we began a series focusing on the issue of rights and responsibilities, individual rights and responsibilities. And we started with the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which was passed in 1641. So that's kind of where we began yesterday. You didn't miss much if you weren't with us because because we, at the end of the program, we just basically had time to scratch the preamble to the document itself. So again, I encourage you to stay with us and to participate actively in the program by sharing, not only with me, but with other listeners and participants, your ideas and your reactions, your comments, your suggestions, whatever you are inclined to bring to the table and share with other people. We want to hear from you, and I want you to know that that is indeed true. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My email address, personal email address, if you'd like to comment on the program itself or on a particular issue that we're dealing with, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, all one word, no punctuation. And O'Brien is I-E-N, not I-A-N. waobrien906@gmail.com. There's been an issue over the last couple of days that has been kind of floating around on the edges, and I didn't address it yesterday because, to be very honest with you, I kind of figured that first of all, I needed more time to pursue the issue before I raised it here. I kind of have this habit. I guess it's from years being in the classroom, but when we are on the verge of talking about a topic or raising a topic in a forum like this, I'd like to have some idea what the topic's about before we throw it out there. I love surprises. I love birthday parties, surprise birthday parties, and all the rest of it. But in this kind of a situation, I'm a little bit unnerved by total surprises. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this subject before I raised it, and I wanted to, if it's okay with folks tuned in, I wanted to hold on the Massachusetts Body of Liberties for a bit, at least until we address another issue. You'll remember a couple of weeks ago, and I know because I've received a number of emails based on it, a lot of you were very, very interested and found it very, very valuable, the time that we spent looking at the 28 Principles of Liberty developed by Cleon Skousen in his book, The 5,000-Year Leap. In fact, I've got a couple of emails from listeners who said that basically they actually were getting their hands on that book because they wanted to read the entire context of the 28 principles, and I think that is wonderful. I can mention to you that this morning for an hour, as I have done every Tuesday morning during the academic year for the last 21 years, I taught a class here at the Shepherd Center in Beckley, West Virginia. It's a senior citizens program. The Shepherd Center began a number of years ago, and that's what it is. It's a program for retirees and senior citizens to kind of get together one day a week and break bread together and enjoy lunch and fellowship. And there are a number of classes. They have dancing classes and exercise classes and quilting classes and repair of small appliances and all the rest of it. And as I've mentioned before, several years ago, actually in 1993, I believe, I began teaching at the Shepherd Center here in southern West Virginia their class on what they call life enrichment. And I've, of course, raised the issue that's a little bit intimidating for me because I have a little bit of trouble enriching my own life, let alone thinking that I have enough to say that I could help enrich somebody else's. But anyway, I began teaching the class about 21 years ago, 1993, I believe, is when I began. It could have been 92, actually. But anyway, I've been there for a long time. And in the course of it, I became a senior citizen myself. So I enjoyed it so much that I joined the group. And it's an absolutely wonderful group. And as I've mentioned before, the only downside to the whole experience is that because we're dealing with senior citizens, over time we lose too many really wonderful people. But I guess that's what life is about anyway, isn't it? And we have for example, I was so thrilled this morning. This morning was our second meeting of this year. The first one was last Tuesday, right after Labor Day. And one of the people that returned to class this morning was a lady here who she's been in there from the very beginning. She's 95 years old. She now no longer drives, obviously, and somebody has to bring her to the Shepherd Center, and then they have to make sure that she has a ride back. Somebody will take her back. But she showed up this morning for class, and it's just wonderful. I just love her. And she is terrific. And if you can imagine a 95-year-old that doesn't look like a 95-year-old and has a mind that is as sharp as a tack, she is terrific. And it was really interesting because I'm kind of into myself here a little bit, and I apologize for that. But I got into this story, and I might as well tell the complete one. My wife left early this morning to go to work, and when she arrived there, she called. We kind of touched base by phone just to make sure that she got there okay. And she asked how I was doing, and I was getting ready for my Shepherd Center class at 9:30 this morning. We talked about 8:30 after she arrived at work, and I told her, I said, this isn't one of my better. For some reason, I said, I can't pinpoint any particular reason for it, but it's kind of one of those days where I feel a little bit depressed for some reason, a little bit down. I said, maybe it's the schedule that I'm trying to run. I have my class at 9:30 with the senior citizens, and then I had a Rotary meeting at noon, and then I have 2 hours here on the virtual center, and then I'm going to be going and tripping the life fantastic this evening as I try to pretend in front of people who know better that I can dance. And it's a pretty full day. And I said, maybe it's just that. But anyway, I'm a little bit down. She said, stay up. It'll be fun and all the rest of it. So I went to class at 9:30, and when I got out of class at 10:30, I called her. And she said, how did your class go? And I said, I ought to have that class every morning of my life. That is the most uplifting, encouraging. When I leave there, I'm just flying. And I feel that way many times here at the Virtual Center. When we sign off after being together for 2 hours, if it's a half-decent program, if I feel that the program was half-decent and it kind of hung together and made sense and seemed to conclude at the appropriate point and all the rest of it, I didn't want to, I don't like to end the program in mid-sentence or anything like that. So if I can organize the program in such a way that I bring it to a conclusion right at the right time after 2 hours, and I just sometimes leave feeling that it's really been a good program, it's been a good day. And that's the way I feel with these folks almost every day. But anyway, I introduced to them, I told them that here on at the Virtual Center, we had spent some time a few weeks ago on Cleon Skousen's 28 Principles of Liberty. I mentioned this last week, and because we were kind of sharing what did you do during the summer kind of thing. That's the way we spent our first week together. And I had told them about Clausen's 28 points, and they said they would really like to spend a little bit of time on them. Most of them had not heard of them. And they said, if it's okay, let's spend a couple of weeks of class on Skousen. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. So I reprinted the 28 principles and for a handout. And then I found online a letter, an article actually that appeared in the New York Times in November of 2010. And it was on Skousen. It kind of put the entire situation into context, if that makes sense. I kind of feel like I'm turning away from the microphone here, and I might be creating a problem, but I'm actually thumbing through my papers here. It was an article that was written on November 26, 2010. It appeared in the New York Times, and the title of it was Radical Constitutionalism, and the author was Jeffrey Rosen. I have read Rosen's pieces in the New York Times before. He's a superb writer and journalist, and usually has something important to say. And what he was pointing out, and of course we kind of played with this as we went through the 28 principles here at the Virtual Center, but what he was pointing out was that the 28 principles are, being a little bit flexible in the way we interpret it. Rosen's position is that the 28 principles that appeared in his 5,000-year leap are pretty much the philosophical foundation for the organization that we've become so familiar with over the last couple of years in American politics, called the Tea Party. And what Rosen did was select what he believed is the epitome of a Tea Party candidate, and talked a little bit about what that candidate ran for office on, and then pointed out the connection between that and Skousen's 28 principles. And we went through this background, and I kind of gave him a principle as, kind of a primer on who Skousen was and what his intent was and what he was trying to do and what some of the issues were and all that. And they found that very, very helpful. We spent almost the entire class on the background of Skousen and on the whole issue of the Tea Party and the nature of what it's doing for or to American politics, depending on where you are ideologically. And then we basically decided that we would spend next week and the week after on the principles themselves. But so enlightening and so uplifting was the discussion with these folks that I kind of made up my mind that it was important that I took some time here at the Virtual Center to share this with you. We covered the 28 principles, and we picked them apart, if you remember. It took 3 days, pretty much 3 two-hour programs, almost a total of somewhere between 5 and 6 hours for us to get through the 28 principles that Skousen identifies. And I found this particular letter by Jeffrey Rosen, and I don't know, some of you may have seen it. If you Google it, if you go online and just Google Jeffrey Rosen, Radical Constitutionalism, November 26, 2010, in the New York Times, you can find it on the New York Times archive page. But I just wanted to share with you because in our discussions about the principles, many of the things that we speculated on, we were kind of reading between the lines of the 28 principles, and many of the things we speculated on are right on as far as Rosen's research suggests. So what it did for me this morning and what it's doing for me right now is kind of confirming the fact that if you read critically and if you ask the right questions of what you read, you can oftentimes speculate and draw meaning from the content to such an extent that you can weave your own explanation as to what the context of the particular document that you're reading is really about. And one of the things we talked about this morning, that I talked about with the senior citizens, is once you read Rosen's article, about Skousen and about the 5,000-year leap and about the Tea Party and its origins and its principles and the rest of it, I began to realize that we had pretty much gleaned much of that just by reading the principles, by reading critically and posing the right questions to the content, and looking for things like intent and tone and all the rest of it, reading between the lines and pulling meaning out of the language in such a way that you can almost weave the historical context for the particular piece of data or the document that you're looking at. And we've already done that here at the Virtual Center, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this issue, except that I want to preface it by suggesting the reason I'm going back to Skousen is because this leads to another issue that we made mention of yesterday, which is Rush Limbaugh's new book for children on Thanksgiving. And that, in turn, leads to this effort by people to begin to suggest that what Skousen is laying out in his 28 principles is indeed historically accurate analysis of what the founders intended in the Constitution of the United States. And that's where I want to go during this first hour. I think there's meaning here. Then we can go back and we can look at the Massachusetts Charter Body of Liberties and begin to pursue our investigation of the whole issue in the 17th and 18th century of rights and responsibilities of citizens in relationship to government. So with that, if you'll bear with me, let me share with you some of what Jeffrey Rosen says in his article entitled Radical Constitutionalism. He begins with the Tea Party, and this is the way it begins. Of the newly elected Tea Party senators, Mike Lee, a 39-year-old Republican from Utah, has the most impeccable establishment legal credentials. The son of Rex Lee, a Solicitor General under Ronald Reagan, he attended law school at Brigham Young and later clerked for Samuel Alito on the U.S. Court of Appeals and then the Supreme Court. So this article begins by looking at Mike Lee, a Tea Party candidate for the United States Senate. Now remember, this article was written in November of 2010. And as we know, Mike Lee was successful in that election. He won that election. And you'll understand why in a moment, because the incumbent that he beat was Bob Bennett. But on the campaign trail, especially during his heated primary battle with three-term Republican incumbent Bob Bennett, Lee offered glimpses of a truly radical vision of the U.S. Constitution, one that sees the document as divinely inspired and views much of what the federal government currently does as unconstitutional. In a sense, then, what Jeffrey Rosen is setting out to do is to connect the Tea Party with Skousen's principles. And what we're going to do then is connect Skousen's principles as the philosophical or ideological foundation of the Tea Party. And then we're going to connect that to those who are insistent on arguing that the Constitution of the United States and the American Republic itself was founded on principles suggested within Skousen's 28 principles. That's where I think we're going. Back to Senator Mike Lee, Tea Party candidate in 2010 for the U.S. Senate from Utah. Lee proposed to dismantle on constitutional grounds the federal departments of education and housing and urban development. He insisted that and this is a quote, that the Constitution doesn't give Congress the power to redistribute our wealth, and vowed to phase out Social Security. He proposed repealing the 16th Amendment, which authorizes the progressive federal income tax, and called the 17th Amendment, which allowed senators to be elected by popular vote rather than by state legislatures, a mistake. He pledged to end what he called, quote, the unauthorized federal occupation of Utah's land, insisting that Congress lacks the constitutional power to designate federally protected wilderness unless the relevant state legislature approves. He embraced nullification, the idea that states have the right, and indeed the duty, to disregard federal laws like the new health care reform bill that they say are unconstitutional. Lee, who is a Mormon and a social conservative, also has equated the Founding Fathers' invocations of a deist God with the moral values of the Mormon Church. As your senator, he promised during the campaign of 2010, I will not vote for a single bill that I cannot justify based on the text and the original meaning of the Constitution, no matter what the Supreme Court says you can do. Unquote. This is the conservative Tea Party position that enabled Mike Lee to take the Republican nominee for the office of senator from the state of Utah out of the hands of Senator Bob Bennett, who had been elected for 3 consecutive terms. Rosen goes on, and now he's moving into the issue of the 28 principles of Cleon Skousen. Like the Tea Party movement itself, Lee's constitutional vision may appear to be an incohesive mixture of libertarianism and social conservatism, of opposition to federal power and support for tearing down the wall of separation between church and state. In fact, however, it represents an exotic, but in its own way coherent idea of the Constitution, one that is consistent with certain familiar strains of legal conservatism and constitutional scholarship, but at the same time is genuinely eccentric and extreme. What he's pointing out is that Lee's Tea Party position is not just a random mix of let's abolish this department, that department, the other department. Let's overturn the 16th Amendment and the 17th Amendment. In other words, it's just not a random hit-and-miss shotgun approach to try to dismantle the effectiveness of government and its ability to operate. Rather, Rosen says, it represents what he calls an exotic, but in its own way, a coherent idea of the Constitution. There is ideological consistency here. It's not just random. And then he goes on and explains, much of the Tea Party's movement's more strident rhetoric, seen in the light of this constitutional vision, may be best understood not as scattershot right-wing hostility to government, but as a comprehensive, if startling, worldview about the proper roles of government and faith in American life. What Rosen is doing is taking Mike Lee at his word and building an ideological framework for the position on government and its relation to the people and the whole idea of faith, of religion and government, that seems to bring in an element of coherence to this whole thing. It's very important that we understand this, because I think there's a tendency to say about the Tea Party folks, they just oppose everything. They want to get rid of this, they want to get rid of that, they want to oppose this, they want to block that. And the implication is they're nothing but obstructionists, and that there's no plan or no agenda. What Rosen is pointing out is there clearly is a plan, there clearly is an agenda, and we need to know what it is. And then Rosen goes in to the link or the connection to the 5,000-year leap. Many of the positions that Lee outlined on the campaign trail appear to be inspired by the constitutional guru of the Tea Party movement, W. Cleon Skousen, whose 1981 book, The 5,000-Year Leap, argued that the Founding Fathers rejected collectivist European philosophies and instead derived their divinely inspired principles of limited government from 5th century Anglo-Saxon chieftains, who in turn modeled themselves on the biblical tribes of ancient Israel. So now what Rosen is doing is connecting the Tea Party, the ideology of the Tea Party, to the 5,000-year leap and the positions of Cleon Skousen in developing his 28 Principles of Liberty, pointing out that Skousen believed that the founders had consciously rejected collectivism. In other words, they rejected socialism. They rejected an emphasis on community in favor of limited principles of government that go back to the 5th century Anglo-Saxons, who modeled themselves on the biblical tribes of ancient Egypt. Ancient Israel, not Egypt. Skousen, a Mormon who died in 2006 at the age of 92, was for years dismissed by many mainstream conservatives, including William F. Buckley Jr., as a conspiracy-mongering extremist. In other words, in his own time, before he died in 2006, prominent conservatives like William F. Buckley considered Skousen to be, and these are Rosen's words, a conspiracy-mongering extremist. He was also eventually criticized by the Mormon Church. He was a vocal supporter of the John Birch Society, and he argued that a dynastic cabal, including international bankers like the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan, conspired to manipulate both communism and fascism to promote a one-world government. This is the old conspiracy theory idea that what we're looking at here is an effort worldwide of international bankers like the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan to manipulate communism and fascism in such a way that we would end up with a one-world government which they would control. Skousen sees this as the ultimate objective that the John Birch Society was created to oppose, and he feels that he must continue to oppose in his 5,000-year leap. Skousen's vision of the Constitution was no less extreme than Mike Lee's. Starting more than 60 years ago with his first book, Prophecy in Modern Times, he wrote several volumes about the providential view of the U.S. Constitution set out in Mormon scripture, which sees the Constitution as divinely inspired and on the verge of destruction, and the Mormon Church as its salvation. So Skousen, when he first began to write in his first book, he obviously argued that the Constitution was divinely inspired, and the Constitution itself was on the verge of destruction until saved by the Mormon Church. Skousen saw limited government as not only an ethnic idea rooted in the Anglo-Saxons, but also a Christian idea, embodied in the idea of unalienable rights and duties that derive from God. And he insisted that the founders, and this is a quote, the founders' religious precepts turned out to be the heart and soul of the entire American political philosophy, unquote. This is a key sentence. Skousen saw limited government in part as a Christian idea that is embodied in the unalienable rights and duties that derive from God. And his argument is that the founders' religious principles turned out to be the very heart and soul of the entire American political philosophy. Skousen is basically laying the groundwork for this idea that the American Republic is divinely inspired, that we are a Christian nation, that the roots of our political system are to be found in Scripture. And right now, in today's world, these are the positions being argued, those who scream the loudest in support of what we call American exceptionalism. that America is on the same mission commissioned by God that the Puritans were under when John Winthrop made his very famous 1630 speech about us being a city upon a hill. They have taken a gargantuan leap from one era to the other in making this case. In 2009, this is only 4 years ago, in 2009, after years of obscurity, Skousen's ideas were unexpectedly rediscovered by Glenn Beck, who was given a copy of The 5,000-Year Leap by a friend. As a result of Beck's endorsement, the book became a bestseller and a Tea Party favorite. Beck's endorsement also revitalized the National Center for Constitutional Studies, which Skousen founded under another name in 1971, and which offered seminars on his books. During the 1990s, his center typically offered no more than a dozen seminars a year. In 2009, however, it offered more than 200 seminars to Tea Party groups across the country. What we are seeing here in this background, brought to us by Jeffrey Rosen in this New York Times article from 2010, is the origin of the Tea Party and the extent to which the ideological foundations of the Tea Party were laid a decade ago by Cleon Skousen in his 5,000-Year Leap and the 28 Principles of Liberty, which he derived or included within it. In September 2010, which is just 2 months before this article was written, the same weekend as the Tea Party march in Washington, I, meaning Jeffrey Rosen, I attended one of these constitutional seminars. Held at the Omni Shoreham Hotel in Washington, D.C., it attracted about 25 people, most of them over 50. That's not a surprise. The seminar was led by Bill Norton, a contractor from Arizona who was mentored by Skousen. Norton explained Skousen's salvation narrative based on the idea that throughout world history, only the people's law of constitutionally limited government has been able to unleash man's creative energies and constrain the spread of what he called ruler's law, like communism and progressivism. Let me repeat that last sentence. Bill Norton, who led this seminar in 2010, in September of 2010, in Washington, D.C., talked about Skousen's narrative, salvation narrative, and argued that throughout world history, its constitutionally limited government, limited to the consent of the governed, participation by the people, as being the only kind of government throughout the history of the world that has been able to unleash man's creative energies, man's creativity, and at the same time has been able to constrain the spread of ruler's law, which is top-down government. And the examples he uses are incredible. Communism and progressivism. The implication is that communism and progressivism are one in the same. I think that's very significant. You'll remember a few weeks ago when we looked at Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism speech, that Roosevelt himself made the point that I could be called a communist, except that what I'm saying is out of the mouth of Abraham Lincoln. So there is this idea that an active, visible government which chooses to govern in the public interest is anti-individual freedom and therefore socialist. Norton went on and said, once the Founding Fathers unleashed the mind of man by codifying religiously based free market principles in a written constitution, we went further than mankind had gone in the 5,000 years previously. So here's the origin of the title of the 5,000-year leap. That the founding fathers, in the system they set up, a system of limited government, which is biblically inspired, unleashed the mind of man by building this government on the religiously based free market principles in a written constitution. And the result was that man's creativity made a leap that exceeded the degree of the leap that man had made in the previous 5,000 years. In other words, it's only when the founders adopted the religiously based, Christian-based ideas of limited government and free market principles. Notice how the suggestion here is that free market principles are biblically based. You know, one of the things I'm thinking of is when Jesus threw the money changers out of the temple. But be that as it may, Norton explains that mankind had gone farther than he had in 5,000 years. And then Rosen's article goes on to the progressive era. But during the progressive era, according to Skousen, America abandoned its founding principles because of the pressure exerted by certain wealthy, influential groups that persuaded the country to embrace a strong centralized government with extensive regulatory power. Remember Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism speech, where Roosevelt is arguing for government regulation of trusts and corporations which deny the freedom or the equality of opportunity to others. And the fact that government needs to break up these trusts, needs to regulate bigness in such a way that bigness will remain goodness. This resulted in a large-scale, government-mandated, entirely unconstitutional redistribution of wealth. In Skousen's history, as in Tea Party politics, socialists and bankers are not opposing forces. The machinations of the wealthy and the machinations of the income levelers are one and the same and must be resisted by defenders of liberty. Norton handed out cards enumerating the 28 principles of liberty that Skousen ascribed to the founders, and he urged us to memorize them. So this is what the seminars based on Skousen's books are about. The memorization of the 28 principles. And the Tea Parties buying into these seminars to the point that in 2009 there were more than 200 of them. What Skousen's 28 principles have become is the ideological foundation of Tea Party attacks on government in this country. This information is critically important, it seems to me. Although Tea Party groups like Dick Armey's Freedom Works have emphasized the movement's libertarianism and played down its social conservatism, several of Skousen's 28 principles stress the role of religious virtue. The fourth principle, for instance, without religion, the government of a free people cannot be maintained. It criticizes the Supreme Court for having misinterpreted Thomas Jefferson's metaphor of a wall separating church and state. So one of the things that Skousen's principle does, his fourth principle about the link between religion and government, is to challenge the separation of church and state. Skousen argued that the First Amendment's prohibition on the federal establishment of religion was not intended to separate church and state, but was instead designed to prevent the federal government from disestablishing religion in the 7 states that had already officially established denominations during the founding era. Skousen's argument is that the First Amendment was not designed to separate church and state at all. The First Amendment's intent, according to Skousen, is to keep the states that had established official religions as state religions from disestablishing those religions. So his argument is that the founders, Jefferson and the others, in arguing the separation of church and state, were distorting the intent of the founders. And the article points out that reputable legal scholars, and one of them is Akil Reed Amar of Yale Law School. Akil Amar has one of the best studies out on the Constitution of the United States. He's a very reputable scholar in today's world. Rosen points out that legal scholars like Amar of Yale University have made similar historical arguments to Skousen's. But in Skousen's view, the implications of this history are radical. Skousen would encourage the states today to require universally accepted religious teachings in public schools, as long as they don't favor one denomination over another. Justice Clarence Thomas, whose wife Virginia Thomas stumped at Tea Party rallies and helped create the Tea Party organization called Liberty Central, has argued in a similar vein that the founders intended to prevent the federal government from disestablishing state churches, not from promoting religion. So what Skousen has done is reinterpret the First Amendment so that the First Amendment becomes not an argument against the formal establishment of religion, but rather an effort to prevent states from disestablishing religions that have already been created. And this is Clarence Thomas talking. Congress need not observe strict separation between church and state or steer clear of the subject of religion, Thomas wrote in a 2005 concurring opinion. Along with Skousen's 28 Principles of Liberty, the best guide to the Tea Party movement's constitutional vision is a list of 101 constitutional questions to ask candidates that is reprinted at the end of the new edition of Skousen's 5,000-Year Leap. Over the last couple of years, you'll remember the number of local political campaigns where Tea Party people in the audience stood up and set out to embarrass candidates and to scream questions at them and force them to back down and back off. If you remember, I used to see these on TV on the news all the time. The origin of this are these 101 constitutional questions that Tea Party people are encouraged to ask political candidates. And these 101 questions are reprinted at the end of Skousen's newest edition of the 5,000-Year Leap. So basically, what is happening here in Skousen is not only laying out the 28 principles, the ideological foundations of the Tea Party, but also included in his book at the end are the 101 questions that Tea Party members can ask candidates for office, which will embarrass them and force them to back down. And thus we have the emergence of the Tea Party as many of us have watched it evolve over the last couple of years since 2009 and 2010. And so basically the article continues with this kind of position. So in a sense, this is Cleon Skousen's legacy since the man passed away in 2006. This is his legacy to American political reality in today's world. His 28 principles have become the ideological foundation of the Tea Party. And Rosen points out that some Tea Party members reject Skousen because he's considered to be a little bit extreme or a little bit more religious than many of them are. But be that as it may, this is the ideological foundation of the right-wing argument that the founding of this nation was religiously inspired, and that that's really what the founders intended to do. That free enterprise capitalism which is not completely endorsed within the Constitution of the United States, although Madison's emphasis on individual freedom, on liberty, in Federalist Number 10, obviously indicates the priorities of individual freedom, which are at the very root of America's political system. It's one thing to say that. It's quite another to say that the founders intended through the Constitution, to stimulate the development and advancement of free enterprise capitalism. You can't prove that, because that suggests that the founders were visionaries, and they could anticipate things like the Industrial Revolution and all the rest of it, which wasn't going to come for close to another century. But the reality of the situation is such that this position of Skousen suggests that the origins of free market capitalism are contained within the intent of the founders, and that this is religiously inspired. And so what you've got here is the ideological foundation for the argument that the American political system, the American public, is a Christian nation that is religiously inspired, and that any effort to separate church and state is an effort to counter the intent and the will of the founders. That's the ideological position for which Cleon Skousen and his 28 principles are the ideological foundation. I think it's incredibly important to know. And, of course, we went through the 28 principles and we looked at them, and we saw much of this in an analysis of those principles. We have about 10 minutes left in this, our first hour. And I guess the question that I'm confronted with at this point is, what is the message here? Because here we are in September of 2013, and we are looking at accounts of a history book, an American history book for children, written by none other than Rush Limbaugh, entitled Rush Revere and the Brave Pilgrims: Time Travel Adventures with Exceptional Americans, by Rush Limbaugh. This is yet the latest version, I would suggest, of what we've been looking at in Cleon Skousen. I'm looking at a review of Limbaugh's book, which I have not read yet. It's just come out. Last Thursday, he announced on his program that he was coming out with this book. He calls it a fearless middle school history. It's about a fearless middle school history teacher named Rush Revere, who travels back in time and experiences American history as it really happened. And of course, on the cover is a colonial theme with a caricature of Rush Limbaugh himself as the hero. And then this review goes on. The story is based on the Thanksgiving-themed tale that Rush Limbaugh regularly shares with ditto heads each holiday season about how the Pilgrims, following that first harvest feast with the Indians, went on to reject communal living. Basically, what Limbaugh's interpretation of Thanksgiving is about is that the truth story of Thanksgiving is the story of the failure of socialism, the failure of communal living by the Pilgrims in favor of individual freedom and self-interest. So this is, I would suggest to you, the latest version of the position argued 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, by Cleon Skousen, and the position which gave rise to the Tea Party in America. I think it is absolutely essential that we understand this principle. And then finally, a book by David Barton entitled The Myth of Separation. It's obviously a challenge to the idea of the separation of church and state. David Barton quotes James Madison as saying, and this is the quote by James Madison according to David Barton in his book, The Myth of Separation. According to Barton, Madison said, "We have staked the whole future of American civilization, not upon the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of all our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves, to control ourselves, to sustain ourselves according to the Ten Commandments." Unquote. As a footnote for that quotation, Barton cites a book written in 1939. Now, supposedly, Madison made the statement in the 18th century. But the footnote for it is a book by Harold Caine entitled Liberty, Cry Liberty, which was published in 1939. The quote appears on page 32 and 33 of Lane's book. In addition to that, a book by Frederick Niemeyer entitled First Principles in Morality and Economics, Neighborly Love and Ricardo's Law of Association, was written in 1958, which picked up that same quote. The only problem with that quote by James Madison is that James Madison never wrote that. This is the extreme example of the degree to which those with a political agenda are using the founders to justify a position and a sense of purpose to America's founding that did not exist, even to the point that they are making up quotes by the founding fathers. The biographer of Madison, none of them who have worked on the Madison Papers have ever been able to find any evidence that Madison made any such statement about the Ten Commandments. Not only that, but Madison's position on separation of church, he was the co-author with Jefferson of the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, which is the basis of separation of church and state in Virginia in 1786. It is inconceivable that Madison could have made a contradictory statement like that quoted here by David Barton. Absolutely inconceivable. Robert Alley, who I happen to know, Robert Alley was a historian at the University of Richmond. He was an historian of religious history. He tried to track down the origin of this quote. His report on that effort is published in the William and Mary Quarterly and is entitled Public Education and the Public Good. And Alley points out that he can find no such Madison quote. In July 1994, an organization entitled Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, the acronym FAIR, F-A-I-R, pointed out that Rush Limbaugh had incorrectly attributed to James Madison a quotation concerning the centrality of the Ten Commandments to American civilization. Rush Limbaugh in 1994 picked up the same quote from Madison about the Ten Commandments. Quickly, rising to Limbaugh's defense were people that wrote to the Los Angeles Times. Here, as quoted in The Myth of Separation by David Barton, is precisely what Madison said. The bogus quote, according to David Barton, follows. We have staked, this is Madison, according to Barton, we have staked the whole future of American civilization, not upon the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of all of our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern themselves, to control ourselves, to sustain ourselves according to the Ten Commandments of God. And this piece that I'm reading from, I believe, Slate, makes the point that what the writer of this, Rick Kroll, did not tell us was that Barton cited as his only source for these words by James Madison two 20th century writers, Harold K. Lane in his Liberty Cry Liberty, and Frederick Niemeyer in his First Principles of Morality and Economics. So what we have here literally are people who are making up quotes of the founders in order to make the case for the origins of the American Republic and the link to them. They are attributing to James Madison a quote that Madison could never have said because it contradicts everything that he said and did when it comes to the issue of religion and politics in American society. It is absolutely incredible. What I did, as I had this information in my hands last evening, what I did is I went to the source, what I believe is the source. And that source is my friend, who's been a friend of mine for 40 years, John Kaminsky, who is the editor of the Ratification Project, the ratification of all the documents of the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution of the United States at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. John has spent 40 years pulling together all of the documentation, all of the letters, all the principles. He has seen everything that exists. And I forwarded this quote to him. And I asked him if he's turned up any evidence that Madison might have made such a statement. And I am thumbing through my papers because I want to share with you John Kaminsky's response, which I just received this morning in a return email. Hang in there with me. It's here, folks, I promise. I think what I'm going to do is take this opportunity to have our end of the hour break. It's 59 minutes after the hour anyway, so it's time for us to take our 5-minute break, and during this 5-minute break, I will find John Kaminsky's email and share it with you. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and after a 5-minute break, we'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and if you're just joining us today, I want to welcome you to today's program. If you've been with us since through our first hour, I want to thank you for staying with us. I mean that very sincerely. I hope that the information and the material that we're covering is information that more than justifies your willingness to commit some of your valuable time to the Head On Radio Network itself and to the Virtual Center specifically. Our goal, I know Bob Kincaid and his folks, their goal at the Horn, and our goal here at the Virtual Center, is to make sure that the time you spend with us is time well spent. We want you to go away from each program a little bit richer and a little bit more knowledgeable than you came into the experience with. That's our goal. We would love to hear from you, your reactions, your suggestions, your comments. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My personal email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906, all one word, @gmail.com. If you're just joining us, we have been looking at some of the documentation supporting the idea that the driving force or the intent of the founders was to establish a religiously based republic based on the principles of free enterprise capitalism. That is the suggestion of a number of books. It is the implication, obviously, of the 28 principles of liberty that were identified by Cleon Skousen in 2006 in his book, The 5,000-Year Leap. Excuse me, the first book was 1981. It was republished in 2009 with a foreword by Glenn Beck. And the point is that in that republication in 2009, Cleon Skousen's 28 principles, along with the associated information in his book, including at the end the 101 questions that Tea Party members are encouraged to ask political candidates during campaigns. Cleon Skousen's principles become the ideological basis not only for the formation of the Tea Party, but for some of the division that exists in our political system today. This is extremely important. And the point that we were making here at the Virtual Center through our first hour is that this ideological agenda is so important to some of these people that they are not above literally fabricating quotations in order to justify their point of view. The example that we used just prior to break was a quotation supposedly from James Madison on page 120 of David Barton's book entitled The Myth of Separation. Barton quotes James Madison as saying the following: "We have staked the whole future of American civilization not upon the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of all our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves, to control ourselves, to sustain ourselves according to the Ten Commandments." And the point that I made is there's no way from the James Madison that I know, historically, that he would have made that statement about the Ten Commandments. James Madison, along with Jefferson, was the co-author in 1786 of the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, which ultimately established the principle of separation of church and state in Virginia. It effectively de-established the Anglican Church as the official church in the state of Virginia during the Confederation period. And it's based on that principle, on that piece of legislation, that Thomas Jefferson, when he becomes President of the United States, begins to talk about the wall of separation that the Supreme Court picks up and adopts as the way this nation will be governed, the separation of church and state. And that's the issue that drives Skousen, that drives David Barton, that drives all of these people, to the point that David Barton includes a quotation from James Madison that nobody can find. Robert Alley at the University of Virginia couldn't find it. And I didn't cover this during our last hour, but let me go back. The editor of the Federalist Papers, the editor of the Madison Papers, is a man named Clarence Mannion, M-A-N-I-O-N. In 1964, Clarence Mannion wrote the following: As Madison stated in The Federalist, our entire political experiment swings upon our capacity to govern ourselves according to the moral law. The only people who can afford the great luxury of civil government strictly limited by law are those people who recognize and are willing to live by the natural God-imposed obligations and responsibilities under the Ten Commandments. Mannion says the following: there is nothing in the Federalist Papers remotely resembling what is argued by Mannion. This is the connection between the Ten Commandments and James Madison. And this is Barton's version, that there's nothing in the Federalist Papers remotely resembling what is argued by Mannion. Madison never mentioned the Ten Commandments in any of the Federalist essays. And as I mentioned before break, last evening I forwarded this article with this quotation to John Kaminsky at the University of Wisconsin. And at 8:43 this morning, I received the answer. Good morning, Bill. I certainly agree with David Matter. Not only has David been editing the Madison Papers for many years, but he also has published a Madison quotation book for the University of Virginia Press. He has never found such a quotation. Neither have I. There is no doubt, John Kaminsky says, that the founding generation firmly believed in a moral society and would surely endorse those parts of the Ten Commandments that strictly deal with morals. Many of them, however, including Madison, strongly advocated the separation of church and state, not only at the federal level but also at the state level. Madison's ideas about the relationship of church and state were probably best written in his memorial and remonstrance, in which he opposed Patrick Henry's attempt to provide public support for Christian ministers in Virginia. In that masterful document, Madison not only advocated the separation of church and state, but he staunchly advocated the individual's right not to have a religion at all. Madison's papers are voluminous, and yet the quotation cannot be found. Until it is located, which I firmly believe will not occur, because the quotation opposes Madison's long-standing beliefs, we must accept the fact that the quotation is a hoax. It is unfortunate that a small group of advocates continues to try to hijack our historical heritage. Best wishes, John. John Kaminsky has spent the last 40 years editing the papers of the founders on ratification of the Constitution. Not only that, but his friend David Mattern, who's been editing the Madison Papers since the 1960s, also set out to try to find this Madison quote and couldn't, as did Robert Alley at the University of Virginia. John Kaminsky's position, like mine, is that it's hard to believe we'll ever find a quote like that from Madison, because it tends to oppose everything that he believed. That's my reaction. I know that Madison was the author of the memorial and remonstrance on the separation of church and state. There's no way in the world he would have written a statement about basing our political system on people's endorsement of the Ten Commandments. There's no way that he would have written such a statement. So when John Kaminsky calls this whole thing a hoax, I think it's absolutely important that we can take this to the bank. These people have absolutely, I'm talking here as a historian. Some of these people seem to have there's no limit. They have no shame. What we are witnessing here is an example of a principle which is not based on historical research. It is based on just the opposite. It is dishonest. It is illusory. and it is designed to put words into the mouths of the founders that were never there. There are two approaches to research, and I can remember dealing with this morning in the Shepherd Center with my class of senior citizens. There is the effort to understand the past by combing through the sources and pulling from those sources the data which gives us the information we need to understand what those who originally wrote these documents and spoke these words meant by what they said in the time they wrote it and said it. In other words, there is the approach to historical research which suggests that you go in without an agenda. You allow the evidence to lead you to the appropriate conclusion which the evidence supports. That is not what David Barton, Cleon Skousen, or any of the others are doing. They are looking at the evidence with an agenda in mind. They know what they want to find. They are looking for evidence to prove the political positions that they want to argue are the positions endorsed by and articulated by America's founders. And what this particular situation about this Madison quote on separation of church and state indicates is they are not above inventing quotations so that the history will reinforce what they wanted to say. Talk about cherry-picking historical evidence. They aren't going back and pulling it out of context. If it's not there, they're willing to make it up. I would suggest to you that this is more than a game of historical gotcha. This speaks to the seriousness and the depth of the political challenge which we face in this nation. What we are witnessing here in the last hour and 20 minutes of our time together here at the Virtual Center so far today, what we are witnessing, it seems to me, is an example of how serious the threat is to this nation. We have people in positions of influence and power who are writing books, and in the person of Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh, who are on the air speaking to millions, writing books for young people, perpetrating this fraud, and able to sell the books because of who they are. What I have to say here at the Virtual Center on this day in September, the day before the 12th anniversary of the infamous September 11th attacks, what I have to say here at the Virtual Center is there is no evidence that I've found. There is nothing that I have experienced in the recent past which speaks louder to me about the importance of keeping the Head-On Radio Network and this voice of true conversation and honesty out there. The marketplace of ideas without this voice, without these positions, is a distorted, very dangerous marketplace. Everybody with influence and power and money has found legal and constitutional justification for throwing their point of view and their positions into the political pot, into the political cauldron, so to speak, based on the idea that the truth will somehow surface in the open competition in the free market of ideas, which constitutes the philosophical basis of our society. I'm one of those people that believes that. But I am also one of those people that recognizes that there is a concerted effort in this country to stifle particular positions and issues on matters which are of vital importance, not only to American citizens who might be tuned in to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution on this particular 10th of September in the year 2013. We are talking about the kind of information that those with power and influence are putting into the hands of our young people and doing it under the name of truth and fact. This stuff is bogus. It is dangerous. It is a lie. Cleon Skousen's Principles of Liberty, which appeared in the 1980s in his book during its first printing, The 5,000-Year Leap, and becomes the focus of the republication of that book in 2009 with a foreword by Glenn Beck. Those principles are not the results of Cleon Skousen's research into the founders. He did not read the Madison papers and the Washington papers and the Jefferson papers and the papers of Patrick Henry and Benjamin Rush and the rest of them, the Adams papers and the rest of them. He did not read those papers and extract those principles from what he read. He took those principles from somewhere else and set out to impose them on the founders and to find the kinds of quotations and evidence which he believed would sell the idea that these principles were indeed what the founders were about. It is dishonest, it is bogus, and it is dangerous. And it is absolutely essential that we here at the Head On Radio Network and on the Virtual Center continue to drive home the evidence to point out what we lack at this point is the audience, is the spread of audience, is the depth of audience. We need to get this information out there, and we need to keep it out there. And we need to keep driving it home over and over and over again. This is dangerous stuff because it's going into our schools and into the hands of our young people. And because so many of our young people are reared in a very religious environment, they are much more inclined to buy this stuff because it seems to have a religious stamp of approval on it than they might ordinarily be. It is absolutely essential that we keep this voice alive. It is absolutely essential that we keep the Head On Radio Network on the air. Because eventually, as long as it's out there, eventually people will begin to pick up on it and begin to spread the word. And that's what we're about here at the Virtual Center. The mission of the Virtual Center is not to encourage professional scholars to engage in research on the founders. The mission of the Virtual Center is to share with the community at large, using modern technology, using the internet, is to share the reality and the substance and the facts of America's founding with the people out there, so that in the long term we will be able to contribute to a much better informed, much more knowledgeable and substantive population of citizens who can recognize spin when they see it, who recognize dishonest research when they see it, and can make sure that it does not succeed. Here at the Virtual Center, this is not an alternative interpretation to the one that's being put out there by the Bartons and the Cleon Skousens and the rest of them. We are not looking for an alternative interpretation. We are basically suggesting that those interpretations are bogus and fraudulent. They are based on historical evidence that is being cherry-picked from the evidence, or in fact is being totally made up if they can't find what they need. If they are willing to go to these lengths in order to make their point, what does that tell us about how serious this issue is? This is not academic bullcrap here that we're talking about. This is substantive information on the nature of our political system and the way it was intended to function. This is substantive information on the requirements and the needs for an educated citizenry in a participatory republic. We're not out there blowing wind here. This is extremely important. And you don't have to listen to me or to Bob Kincaid or any of the other folks here at the Virtual Center or at the Head On Radio Network to know this. All you have to do is look at the lengths to which these people are willing to go in order to get their position out. And I would suggest to you that it's very important to recognize if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. These people are out to manipulate public opinion in this country to a point of view which satisfies their personal self-interest as much as anything else. They are dangerous, and they must be recognized for the danger that they pose to our society. It is very important that we take this threat seriously and we do the best we can to support ourselves as we seek to counter lies and innuendo and taking issues out of context and all the rest of it. But the fabrication of documentation, the making up of quotes to take the founders and put them in a position of something you can't find evidence they said it, so you make it up. And then what you do is you turn around and quote each other. And you put page after page of footnotes at the end of your books because the mere appearance of those footnotes suggests honest scholarship. And what they're doing is footnoting each other. The best example of this, oh, not the best, I think this is the best. But another example of this are the books that have been put out in recent years by one Ann Coulter. Those books, if you look at the history of those books, they are literally being written over long weekends. They are going into the modern technology sources like LexisNexis and all the rest of these places and pulling out relevant quotes that support what they want to say. And if you read the books, chapter after chapter is merely quote after quote after quote to suggest support for the political, ideological positions that they want to get out there. There's no scholarship or writing associated with it. It's merely assembling. You do an internet search, pay your fee, go to LexisNexis, and basically say to the computer, give me all the quotations, all the statements of all of those prominent people who have said such and such and such and such about Democrats or about Barack Obama, about the Affordable Health Care Act, or whatever it is you want to write about. And you've got the makings, the data for a chapter in a book in the matter of an hour. All you need is a long weekend to put it together. It is bogus and it is ideologically driven, And the process of page after page of footnotes and documentation has no substance at all, because the people you're quoting are being taken out of context, and they may or may not have said what you're quoting them as saying within the context that you are interpreting it. Or, as we've discovered today in Barton's book, it's entirely possible that they're making up the whole thing. And then what you do is you quote somebody from 1939 who included that quote in a book in 1939 from a person who had the same kind of an agenda as what people have today. So let me get off my soapbox here. We have a half an hour left. It's the bottom of our second hour. So let me kind of shift gear. I want to go back to the issue of rights and liberties we started yesterday with the Massachusetts body of liberties, the fundamental Constitution and Statement of Rights and Responsibilities of Citizens in a God-fearing republic, which is the colony of Massachusetts in the middle of the 17th century. But I could not let today go by without addressing some of these issues. And I'm hoping at some point in time that we can get John Kaminsky to join us here at the Virtual Center, to call in one day and we'll have a conversation. If for no other, John's been a friend for, as I say, for 40 years. We went to graduate school together. And I know that there's nobody, because his job, his grant, is to publish the documents associated with ratification, to provide this kind of scholarly data for those in the future who will research and write about the founding and the framing of the Constitution and the issues involved in the ratification of the Constitution in those states. He cannot afford to omit or leave out evidence. And when he tells me that there's no letter by James Madison that says that the principles on which the Federalist Papers are based on the principles of the Ten Commandments, James Madison would never say that. It's not that he's opposed to morality and he doesn't believe that morality is a very important part of our political fabric. As John Kaminsky said in his email to me this morning, there's nothing in it which suggests that Madison himself was in favor of morality, and he believed that, that those things which would strictly deal with morals he was comfortable with. What he was not comfortable with is denominational sectarianism in religion. In a divided, diverse society made up of so many different groups of people of different religious beliefs, including those whose individual right to not have a religion at all was respected by Madison, he would never attribute the framing of the Constitution and the founding of the nation on the Ten Commandments. He would never do it. And with that, I'm going to basically pause for a second and then shift gears and try to get into an issue which we'll pursue tomorrow here at the Virtual Center, which is based on the whole issue of rights and liberties. We talked a little about it yesterday. Let me kind of spend a moment at least to talk about where I think we need to go with this. I'm prepared here to look at not only the fundamental bodies of liberties, the body of liberties passed in Massachusetts in 1641. That's 1641. That's 11 years after the Pilgrims landed in Boston Harbor. John Winthrop is still governor. John Winthrop is going to be called before the Massachusetts General Court 4 years later in 1645 and is going to be questioned on whether, in fact, he and those of his administration are violating their legitimate constitutional powers. And in his response, John Winthrop is going to say that while the people call him and his magistrate and other magistrates to office, Their accountability is to the covenant they have with God, not to the people who call them to the office. And then he goes on in that same document to talk about the two kinds of liberty: natural liberty, which is the right to do whatever you want, and what he calls civil liberty or federal liberty, which is the freedom to do that which is good, just, and honest. And he talks about the latter, civil liberty, as being consistent with authority in God's law. Natural liberty is what he calls a distemper thereof. 4 years before Winthrop issues this testimony before the Massachusetts General Court, that same legislature, that same General Court, issues the Body of Liberties for the state of Massachusetts, which is an effort to lay down the rights and responsibilities of citizens living within this godly community. And again, as we pointed out yesterday, it's important to recognize that these people are all of the same religion. We are not talking about majorities and minorities here. We're not talking about dissenting opinions. We are talking about unanimity. We are talking about 100% consensus to the rights and responsibilities of man within a state modeled on God's Word. That is the definition of community that I think we need to begin with here in our consideration of the whole issue of rights and responsibilities. But we're not going to spend all our time in the 17th century. We're going to move into the 18th century. And we are going to look at the unalienable rights of Thomas Jefferson as articulated in the Declaration of Independence. We are going to look at the rights of man and the citizen as articulated in 1789 in France. We are going to look at the revision of those rights in France in 1793 in a reissuing of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen during the height of the French Revolution. And we are going to compare and contrast the difference in influence and emphasis between those documents. We are also going to look at the American Bill of Rights passed by Congress in 1791 in the 13 United States of America. We're going to look at the Bill of Rights. We're going to look at the situation which gave rise to them. We are going to look at the Bill of Rights up against the Massachusetts Body of Liberties of 1641, the Declaration of Independence of 1776, and the French Declarations of the Rights of Man and Citizen, both the Virgin in 1789 and that revision of 1793. And then we're going to look at Supreme Court interpretations of these rights. It is absolutely vital that we understand the basis of rights in our society, in our republic, but also recognize the issue of responsibility that is associated with those rights, because the same people who have been involved in the perpetration of the fraud that we've been looking at here in terms of cherry-picking evidence and creating quotations and assigning them to the founders that they never wrote or never said, those same people are the people who argue a very unique, distinctive interpretation of rights and liberties in America. Cleon Skousen believes, and Jeffrey Rosen's article about Cleon Skousen makes the point, that Cleon Skousen was very much a believer in the idea that the inalienable rights written into the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, are the God-given rights that established the link between Christianity and the republic created in America in 1776. That Jefferson's preamble to the Declaration of Independence, for all practical purposes, is a restatement of God's law and God's intent, according to Cleon Skousen. If you accept that, if you believe that to be true, then you have no choice but to accept the fact that the Constitution of the United States is merely the political strategy designed to fulfill God's plan as articulated within the Declaration of Independence. You have to believe, as does Skousen, that the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence are connected. You have to believe that one is filling out the details in order to enforce or bring about the other. You have to accept the fact that the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence are not contradictory and independent of each other, but are rather consistent and supportive of each other. You have to deny the realities of Confederation history in America. You have to deny Madison's vices of the American political system. When James Madison lays out the reasons why he believes the Articles of Confederation cannot work, and the fact that we need a Constitution of the United States in order to make independence work for Americans. The Constitution of the United States contradicts, denies much of the Declaration of Independence. There is no mention in the Constitution of the United States of anything like inalienable rights. There is no mention in the Constitution of the United States of a creator. There is no mention of God. There are contained within the Constitution a number of rights. The rights to jury trial, the rights to face your accuser, the rights to an attorney, many of the things that we take for granted as part of our political system today and our legal system. Many of those rights in there. But the Constitution does not suggest in any way that they are God-given or absolute or unalienable or natural rights, according to John Locke, or whatever term you want to use to define them. These are civil rights. These are specific rights associated with the political system that we are trying to create in this country, which is a republic, a participatory republic, a republic in which the citizens play a vital role. And so, in a sense, the rights contained within the Constitution of the United States, including the Bill of Rights attached to them after the Constitution is ratified, are in the context of civil rights, not unalienable rights. They are not rights that precede the creation of government under the Constitution of the United States. They are rights that exist because of the existence of that document. The fact that Madison and leading Federalists who are pushing hard for the ratification of the Constitution do not believe that a Bill of Rights is even necessary would seem to indicate, to me at least, that the issue of individual rights was not really the issue about what the Constitution of the United States was about. The issue that the Constitution is about is the location of power. It's where power is located. And the reason that the location of power is important is because Madison and the other Federalists knew that where you put power is the determining factor in who gets control of it, who exercises it. Under the Confederation period, power was at the state level. And the founders' commitments from 1776 to set up Republican governments on the model articulated by Montesquieu in his Spirit of the Laws suggested that the nature of a republic is that it had to be small. The reason it had to be small is because the role of the representative in a representative system like ours, the role of the representative was to represent the best interests of the citizens who elect them. And the only way that that could happen is if the representative knew the priorities and interests, the needs and wants of the citizens they represent. And the only way they could know that was to make sure that the area they represented was small enough that they could familiarize themselves with the needs and wants of the citizens who sent them, who elected them to office. That, in the eyes of Montesquieu, was the ideal republic. The Constitution of the United States and the vices of the American political system drafted by James Madison in a year before, in early 1787, speaks loud and clear to the fact that the principal purpose of ratification of the Constitution, according to the guy who drafted it, was to essentially undo the definition of republicanism that existed in the 1780s and come up with a totally new definition, one in which the elected representative would have the power to define the public interest for those who elect him. Just as John Winthrop said in 1645, that while the people choose us to office, our accountability is not to them, it's to God. When you vote for us, you are giving us the right to define God's will as we see it in Scripture. And our accountability is not to you who elected us, but to the God who called us to this office. Madison's position in 1787 and 1788 is pretty much the same when it comes to his view of the Constitution of the United States. Madison believes that the majority of the people are not qualified, are not capable, are not educated enough, are not serious enough, are not civically minded enough to make decisions, major decisions, which define and provide a direction for this nation. Those are decisions that only the best people can make. The people that are raised and educated and trained to understand the public interest and understand the world in which they live enough to make those kinds of important decisions. So the definition of republic that Madison is talking about in the Constitution is to implement the same kind of definition that John Winthrop talked about in 1645. The people elect their representatives. but the representatives are not accountable directly to the people for what the people want. The representatives, when they are elected, are granted the rights to make decisions in the name of the people who elected them, not to take their marching orders from those same people. In other words, the republic that James Madison is talking about in 1787 and 1788 is a republic where elected officials are chosen by the people, but a republic in which the people's power, the consent of the governed, transfers from the people to those they elect as a result of the electoral process. What we are talking about here is a total switch, a total shift in the definition of the elected representative. The representative, and this is Edmund Burke in Great Britain talking, the representative is not the agent of the people who elected him. The representative is the delegate of the people. The idea being that the people, in choosing a particular representative, delegate to that representative their decision-making power. And of course, the recommendation, the idea is that in a republic, elected representatives will do the best they can to stay in touch with their constituents so they will know as best they can what the priorities, needs, and wants of the citizenry is. But as long as you make sure, says Madison, that there is never a majority faction which would have the power to tell the representative how to vote and what to do, as long as you make sure that there are enough competing factions involved that there's never a majority faction, then the power to make decisions stays with the elected representatives. That's the major change in America's political system in the 1780s. If you are to subscribe to the thinking of the David Bartons and Cleon Skelsons and Glenn Becks and Rush Limbaughs and the rest of them, you have to deny that reality. You have to deny the reality of the Federalist Papers. You have to deny the reality of James Madison's Vices of the American Political System. You have to deny the reality of Confederation politics in America during the 1780s. You have to deny the letters back and forth between leading Federalists about what they need to do, why they need to do it, and how best they can pull it off. Because what you have to argue is that the Constitution of the United States was merely the follow-through necessary to implement the unalienable rights defined by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Basically, that's what these folks have to argue. And in order to do it, they have to deny the reality of history. They have to basically contradict the evidence. They have to find ways to resist the reality of the evidence. And the way, apparently, that they have chosen to do it is either by cherry-picking the past and finding quotations which seem to say what they want to say, or, in the case of David Barton, making up quotations and assigning them to people that you would like to believe said them, even though there's no evidence that they did. This morning, in the senior citizens class, as an example of this kind of thing, of how you can cherry-pick or how you can take information and totally change meaning by taking it out of context, the example that we used was George Washington. If you read George Washington's farewell address, there's a number of references in there to the Creator and the Founder and God and all the rest of it. And so it would be very, very easy to make the point from that document, from that farewell address, that George Washington is a very religious, Skousen-like Christian who is very committed to the idea that the direction of the nation needs to be very consistent and directly connected to the Ten Commandments and the tenets of Christianity and all the rest of it. The fact of the matter is, if you look at the evidence, you're confronted by a serious contradiction. Let me explain what I mean. During the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia, while the convention was meeting from May of 1787 until the 17th of September, 1787. George Washington, according to the records, George Washington went to church 3 times during the summer of 1787. Not only did he go to church 3 times, he went to 3 different churches. If you read his journals and his diaries and letters, the evidence is there. He not only went to church 3 times during the summer of 1787, he went to 3 different churches. But it gets even better. The first visit to a church during his time in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, his first visit was to the Roman Catholic Church in Philadelphia. That fact drives the right nuts. It's very hard to argue. It's very easy to argue from the farewell address that George Washington is a very religious person, etc., etc., etc. But then when you look at his behavior and look at the evidence, you begin to see a contradiction between what he does and what he talks about in the farewell address. The historical evidence suggests something else. That Washington's farewell address, most of it was not written by Washington, it was written by Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton crafted the farewell address of George Washington in order to meet the political realities of 1796, when Washington issued his farewell address, when he announced that he would not run for a 3rd term. And the issues of party were very real in American politics in 1796. James Madison was one of the leading lights, if you will, of an opposition party which was emerging within the Constitution, within the Congress of the United States, which ultimately is going to become the Jeffersonian Republican Party. And Hamilton's intent is to crush that party by using Washington's farewell address as an opportunity for the nation to receive advice from the man they revered the most, George Washington. And Alexander Hamilton drafted the farewell address to meet the political objectives of American politics in the mid-1790s as he saw them. So one has to conclude that Hamilton believed that frequent references to the divine, to the Creator, to God, were important to his political agenda in the 1790s. And once you realize that, then you begin to appreciate the fact that Washington's day-to-day behavior in terms of his approach to religion is not quite what the language of the farewell address seems to imply. In fact, what I concluded is that what I see in George Washington is an effort to know. He's in search of answers. He doesn't have them. He doesn't know all the answers. He's still trying to figure it out. Even at his advanced age in the 1790s, he's going to die later, a few years later. As I reach that same point in my life, I'm searching for answers also. I find it incredibly reinforcing and encouraging when people like James Madison and Washington believe the same thing I do. It is 5 p.m. Our time together is up. I have run right up to the end of the time, and I apologize for that. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien. Please stay with us. We'll be back tomorrow, and we'll look at the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. Be safe, enjoy your evening, and thank you.